"You're not invited, poor old man. Leave. Only my wife's parents are invited." My son's words crashed into the room like a sledgehammer, shattering every fragile thread of patience I had left. I froze for a moment, holding my fork midair, watching as the veins on his forehead bulged with anger. His hand moved forward, pushing me back from the family table. The force wasn't strong, but the intent behind it stung worse than any physical blow. Around us, the room was silent, my daughter-in-law's indifferent gaze piercing, as though this scene was scripted, and she was merely an observer in a performance she had mastered long ago. I didn't shout. I didn't retaliate. I simply rose from my chair, feeling the old ache in my knees protest, and moved toward the study. The living room felt alien, suffused with arrogance and disrespect, the echoes of laughter and chatter that had once filled it replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. I paused for a moment by the doorway, glancing back at the empty chair where my son sat, his chest rising and falling rapidly, eyes bright with unchecked indignation. He had mistaken authority for entitlement, confusion for wisdom, and impatience for power. I let the silence envelop me, a shield more formidable than anger. In my study, I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma grounding me in a calm I hadn't felt since my youth. I sank into the chair, letting the warmth seep into my hands, and allowed my mind to wander over the years, the decades of careful guidance, the nights I stayed late to cover his bills when the business faltered, the weekends I sacrificed to teach him responsibility, the endless patience I had shown even when my own desires were deferred. All of it had been taken for granted, dismissed in a moment of selfish pride. I didn't feel the need to explode or demand respect. Experience had taught me the strength of restraint. Sometimes, the quiet observer sees more than the one in the eye of the storm. Hours passed, and the house seemed to shift around me. Light filtered through the blinds, striking the dust in the air, revealing motes that danced like tiny witnesses to my contemplation. I looked at the scattered papers on the table: wedding invitations, receipts, contracts, symbols of the order I had quietly maintained, now ignored and dismissed. My son had chosen to insult me publicly, to humiliate me in front of family, and yet the real power remained mine. I could cancel arrangements, withhold support, or quietly let events unfold. All the energy that came with retaliation had been absorbed by patience, and in that quiet, I found clarity. Late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages from the wedding planner, vendors, and the florist. Confusion was already setting in. The cancellations my son thought would exclude me entirely were creating ripples he hadn't anticipated. The venue manager needed confirmation. The caterer sought instructions. The florist had questions about arrangements. His impulsive anger had set off a chain reaction, and I simply observed, sipping my coffee, allowing the tension to grow naturally. The lesson would be learned not by shouting, but by consequence. I went for a short walk around the garden, breathing in the cool autumn air, the leaves crunching underfoot. Each step reminded me of the quiet authority that comes with age and experience, the power of observation, the discipline of patience, and the inevitability of truth revealing itself. My mind wandered to my son's pride, how easily it could be punctured when the illusion of control was stripped away. I knew that the next few days would teach him more than any lecture or scolding ever could. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the house, I returned to the study. I sat quietly, reviewing the wedding contracts and notes I had kept meticulously for years. My son had thought that excluding me would prevent disruption, but he hadn't realized that preparation, foresight, and responsibility often outweigh raw anger. The quiet storm was already gathering, subtle but unstoppable. By the time he would recognize it, the consequences of his own actions would have begun to unfold, and I would remain calm, observing the results of choices made in haste and disrespect. By nightfall, I made a decision. I would not attend the table again until respect was restored. Not because I wanted revenge, but because boundaries define relationships. They are not negotiable when violated. Tomorrow, the first ripple of consequence would reach him, and he would understand slowly, inexorably, that power without respect is fragile, and that patience is often the loudest voice in the room. I closed the ledger, letting the quiet settle around me. The storm had begun, and I was ready to witness its course. The next morning, the house felt strangely quiet. The usual hum of activity, the dishwasher, the clatter of breakfast utensils. The low chatter of family was replaced by an uneasy stillness. I moved deliberately through the rooms, noting small signs of disruption. The chair at the kitchen table still slightly askew, the stack of unopened mail, a forgotten napkin on the floor. My son had left early, probably to avoid confrontation. But the ripple of his own anger lingered in the air like smoke. By mid-morning, the first signs of consequences began to arrive. A text from the florist mentioned a scheduling conflict caused by the sudden cancellation of my attendance. Another message, this one from the venue, expressed concern that certain arrangements had been disrupted without proper notice. Even the caterer was reaching out, confused and hesitant. The system my son had tried to manipulate was already straining under the weight of his impulsive decisions. I sat quietly, observing, my hands folded over a cup of coffee, letting the tension build naturally. Later, my son called, his voice tight and hurried. He asked questions about contracts, payments, and vendor confirmations, realizing too late that he had underestimated the complexity of the arrangements. I answered calmly, providing the clarity he lacked, but without yielding to panic or fear. I could have reacted with anger, but experience had taught me that patience is far more powerful than rash confrontation. I let him speak, interrupting only to clarify facts, never to lecture, never to scold. The lesson I knew would land harder than any rebuke. In the afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. The wedding planner had come by personally, a polite but firm expression on her face, holding a thick folder of notes. She mentioned that several vendors were on the verge of canceling services due to miscommunication. She glanced at me with a mix of curiosity and cautious respect, as if recognizing the quiet authority I held. I assured her that the situation would be handled, but I made no promises to intervene unnecessarily. My son's actions had created the problem, and the resolution would emerge from the very chaos he had initiated. The day continued with a steady stream of messages and calls. Friends and distant relatives, unaware of the confrontation at the table, reached out with questions and subtle concern. Rumors had already begun to circulate, small whispers that suggested tension, disrespect, and a fracture in family unity. I did not respond to these messages. The unfolding drama was no longer about control or authority. It was about allowing natural consequences to play out, and watching how those who believed themselves in charge reacted when the structures they depended upon began to wobble. That evening, I watched my son return from a series of frantic errands. He moved through the house with a distracted urgency, his usual confidence replaced by hesitation. I could sense the beginnings of humility creeping into his posture, the realization that disrespect and entitlement carry a cost far greater than he had anticipated. I did not approach him, nor did I speak. Silence, once again, proved more instructive than words. The first layers of understanding were beginning to form. He was starting to see, if only faintly, that the world does not bend to anger alone. As night fell, I reflected on the events of the day. Each call, message, and minor disruption served as a lesson not just for my son, but for the entire household. Entitlement has a short shelf life, I thought, and pride without accountability crumbles under its own weight. I reviewed the contracts and notes once more, meticulously, ensuring I had a complete understanding of the situation. Every detail, every clause, every obligation was a lever, tools of consequence waiting to be exercised, if necessary. But for now simply standing as a testament to foresight and patience. Before retiring for the night, I walked through the quiet house one last time. The dining table, still bearing traces of the previous evening's conflict, seemed less like a site of humiliation and more like a stage where lessons would be taught. I paused by the window, looking at the street below, calm but alert. The tension that had erupted yesterday was only the beginning. The real unfolding, where my son would have to reconcile his actions with the consequences, was just beginning. And I would watch, steady and patient, as the truth slowly revealed itself. The morning after, the house felt heavier than ever. The previous night's events had left a lingering tension in the air, thick and suffocating, almost tangible. I moved slowly through the rooms, observing the subtle signs of unease. My son's shoes abandoned haphazardly in the hallway, the half-empty coffee cup still on the counter, a note from his wife with clipped instructions. Everything spoke of hurried attempts to regain control, but control, I knew, cannot be reclaimed once it has been carelessly surrendered. By mid-morning, the consequences of yesterday's confrontation began to cascade outward in ways neither my son nor his wife could have anticipated. Vendors called with urgent requests, seeking clarity on canceled arrangements, missed deadlines, and conflicting messages. My son's earlier confidence had evaporated. His voice, once sharp and demanding, now trembled slightly as he tried to negotiate solutions. I listened patiently, offering guidance only when asked, never imposing my own authority. The lesson was not in coercion. It was in letting the weight of responsibility reveal itself naturally. Hours later, my son appeared at my study door, hesitant, uncertain. He held a stack of papers, and his usual air of entitlement was replaced by a strange, almost awkward humility. He attempted to explain his mistakes, stammering slightly as he realized the magnitude of his actions. I observed quietly, noting the tension in his shoulders, the subtle avoidance in his gaze, the nervous tapping of his fingers. Each gesture betrayed the discomfort that comes from the sudden awareness that one's arrogance has consequences far beyond what was ever imagined. I asked him to sit, motioning to the chair opposite me. We spent the next several hours meticulously reviewing the wedding arrangements, vendor contracts, and guest communications. I let him speak first, detailing the chaos his decisions had created, then asked him to map out solutions, pointing out the flaws, gaps, and oversights in his approach. Every misstep, every rushed decision, every ignored detail became a point of reflection. He began to understand that organization, foresight, and respect are not mere suggestions. They are the foundation of every successful endeavor. Whether it's a family celebration or life itself, during this intense session, I noticed subtle changes in him. The panic that had dominated his posture and expression was gradually giving way to focus. He began to pause before speaking, weigh his words, and consider consequences. It was as if the weight of accountability had finally settled on his shoulders, forcing him to mature in ways he had resisted for years. His wife, who had been observing silently from the living room, also seemed unsettled. The dynamic between them shifted imperceptibly as they realized that no amount of anger or entitlement could undo the consequences that were unfolding. Late afternoon brought another wave of realization. Calls from relatives and friends who had been left in the dark began to clarify just how far-reaching the effects of my son's actions had been. Invitations, RSVPs, and arrangements that had seemed minor now revealed themselves as pivotal. My son's attempts at quick fixes were faltering under scrutiny, exposing gaps and inconsistencies. I did not intervene directly. I allowed the natural order of accountability to teach the lesson. Each call, each correction, each small failure reinforced the inevitability of consequences. And I could see comprehension slowly dawning in his eyes. By evening, the atmosphere in the house had shifted significantly. The tension that had dominated the morning and afternoon had given way to a cautious reflection. My son, once brimming with confidence and impatience, now moved deliberately, consulting contracts, notes, and schedules with an attentive focus I had never seen before. His wife, equally subdued, seemed to absorb the weight of the unfolding events, her earlier indifference replaced by subtle acknowledgement of responsibility. And I, sitting quietly in the study, observed without interference. The calm eye at the center of the storm, knowing that patience, foresight, and restraint had created a lesson no anger could ever teach. As night fell, I walked through the silent house, taking note of each small sign of transformation. The dining table, once a stage for humiliation, now held the remnants of careful planning, evidence that reflection and accountability were beginning to take hold. The ripple of yesterday's confrontation had grown, touching not just my son, but everyone in the household. The lesson of respect, of understanding boundaries, and of the weight of one's actions was spreading quietly but relentlessly. And I, the quiet observer, could finally see the first true signs of change taking shape. The next morning, the house seemed to hold its breath. Every movement I made was accompanied by a quiet sense of anticipation, as if even the walls were aware that change was underway. I walked through the hallway slowly, noting the subtle signs of unrest. My son's jacket left on the arm of a chair, the half-folded napkins from breakfast, the way his wife lingered near the staircase, hesitant to enter the study where I sat with the contracts spread before me. Each detail reflected the shift that had begun, an invisible tension that demanded acknowledgement and adaptation. My son appeared shortly after, trying to mask the uncertainty that had settled on him. He cleared his throat and attempted casual conversation, but I saw through the veneer. His attempts at control were faltering, and I allowed the silence to stretch, letting him feel the weight of his own missteps. I could see the subtle changes in his posture, shoulders less rigid, eyes scanning for understanding, hands fidgeting with documents he had once thought trivial. The lessons of yesterday had begun to take root, forcing him into reflection, accountability, and a humbling recognition of his own limitations. Throughout the morning, we worked through the chaos together, piece by piece. Vendors' questions, logistical challenges, and miscommunications formed a tangled web that required patience, precision, and calm reasoning to unravel. My son stumbled at times, frustration creeping into his voice, but he corrected course when prompted, slowly learning that anger and entitlement were insufficient tools for solving real-world problems. His wife, once confident in her ability to manage or manipulate, now observed quietly, absorbing the gravity of our methodical approach. I said little, guiding subtly, my calm demeanor emphasizing the contrast between reasoned patience and impulsive aggression. By afternoon, the ripple effects of the earlier confrontation had spread beyond the immediate family. Friends, distant relatives, and vendors had begun to notice inconsistencies in the planning and cancellations. My son's attempts at damage control exposed gaps that could only be fixed through careful attention and deliberate action. I let him experience the challenge firsthand, intervening only when absolutely necessary, ensuring that each realization, the consequences of dismissiveness, the cost of disrespect, the fragility of authority without understanding, was internalized fully. This was more than correction. It was a lesson in humility and foresight, unfolding naturally, step by painstaking step. The evening brought a subtle shift. My son and his wife worked in tandem, coordinating details and double-checking schedules. The tension in the house had softened, replaced by a tentative sense of order. I observed quietly from the study, watching the gradual transformation. The arrogance that had once dominated the room had diminished, replaced by reflection and attentiveness. I noticed small gestures, an apologetic glance, careful consultation before decisions, the acknowledgement of overlooked details that spoke volumes about the growth occurring in front of me. Later, I walked into the living room where both my son and his wife were reviewing final details for the wedding arrangements. Their earlier indifference and disregard had been replaced by genuine engagement. They were listening, thinking, and collaborating, a process they had once assumed unnecessary. I let them work without interference, allowing the natural consequences of their prior behavior to cement the lesson. The power of patience, foresight, and quiet authority had begun to manifest in tangible change. As night fell, I found a moment of quiet reflection on the porch. The soft golden light of dusk filtered across the garden, and I could see the subtle changes in the household through the window. My son moved with deliberation, his earlier impatience tempered by a growing awareness of responsibility. His wife's posture indicated acceptance, the understanding that disregard and manipulation cannot withstand the weight of natural consequences. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The storm of the past days had passed, leaving a calm, measured respect in its wake. The lesson had been delivered, not through confrontation or anger, but through the unfolding consequences of actions taken without foresight. The following morning, the house was unusually still. Even the usual background noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze seemed muted, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked through the hallway slowly, noting the subtle shifts in the household. My son had begun leaving things in order, rather than haphazardly discarding them. His wife, who once maintained a haughty composure, now moved with a careful, measured precision, checking and double-checking arrangements before acting. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, but unlike before, it carried a sense of reflection and realization. By mid-morning, my phone began to buzz with messages from vendors, friends, and distant relatives. Confusion and frustration had rippled outward from my son's rash decisions, and each message served as a reminder of the consequences he had set in motion. I read them silently, taking note of the mounting pressure he was under, but I did not intervene. Letting him experience these challenges firsthand was essential. He needed to understand that respect, foresight, and careful planning cannot be bypassed through entitlement or anger. Every unanswered call, every unresolved question, was a small, patient teacher nudging him toward humility. Around noon, my son entered the study, carrying a pile of papers, his expression tense. He attempted to speak, but the words faltered mid-air. I gestured for him to sit and allowed the silence to hang, heavy and instructive. When he finally began, he spoke cautiously, choosing words with care. His tone lacked the arrogance of days past. He acknowledged errors, admitted oversights, and for the first time, looked at me not as an obstacle or inconvenience, but as a source of guidance and authority. The transformation was subtle yet undeniable. Years of entitlement and impatience were slowly giving way to respect and awareness. The afternoon passed in meticulous review. Together, we worked through contracts, vendor schedules, and guest confirmations. I guided only when necessary, asking probing questions, encouraging him to think critically, and letting him experience the weight of responsibility firsthand. Every minor error he had previously ignored became a point of reflection. Each miscalculation, each overlooked detail, revealed itself not as a failure but as an opportunity for growth and understanding. The lesson was not punitive. It was instructional, unfolding naturally through the unfolding consequences of his own actions. Meanwhile, his wife moved quietly around the house, assisting where appropriate, but no longer attempting to dominate or control the situation. The balance of power had shifted subtly but definitively. She began to understand that influence is not wielded through intimidation or dismissiveness, but through respect, collaboration, and recognition of responsibility. Small gestures, a nod before action, a pause to confirm decisions, betrayed her growing awareness. The household was transforming before my eyes, the tension gradually replaced by a sense of accountability and measured respect. By late afternoon, the culmination of the day's efforts was becoming evident. The wedding arrangements, once in chaos, now reflected careful planning and thoughtful consideration. Vendors were appeased, schedules aligned, and communications clarified. My son's posture had shifted from rigid defensiveness to focused engagement. Each task he completed, Each problem he resolved reinforced the understanding that respect and foresight cannot be bypassed. The lessons of humility, patience, and accountability were taking hold not through admonishment, but through lived experience. As night descended, I walked to the front porch, sipping tea, observing the quiet energy of the household. The glow of lamplight through the windows revealed a scene transformed, tension replaced by careful coordination, arrogance tempered by reflection, and impatience yielding to deliberation. I allowed myself a brief, quiet smile. The storm of the past days had shaped more than schedules and arrangements. It had begun to shape character. My son and his wife were learning, perhaps for the first time, that actions have consequences, that entitlement falters when met with accountability, and that true respect is earned, not demanded. The morning dawned crisp and clear. Yet inside the house, tension was almost tangible. My son moved with deliberate care, consulting notes, cross-referencing contracts, and double-checking communications he had previously brushed off. His wife followed quietly, assisting without assertion, her confidence tempered by the weight of accountability she had only recently begun to grasp. For the first time in years, the household operated not on assumption or entitlement, but on deliberate, careful consideration. I observed from my study, a calm anchor in the center of what had once been chaos. Knowing that the culmination of lessons long overdue was finally reaching its peak. By mid-morning, the repercussions of my son's earlier actions began to fully crystallize. Vendors and relatives had aligned their schedules in response to the delays and confusion, but only through careful negotiation and correction could the plan be salvaged. Each call my son made carried the strain of realization, the subtle tremor of recognition that his previous arrogance had been costly in ways he could never have predicted. He faltered at times, but with each error corrected, a layer of maturity settled over him, replacing the impulsive energy that had so often defined him. His wife, too, seemed to absorb the gravity of the situation, adjusting her approach with newfound care, realizing that dominance and disdain could not substitute for wisdom or foresight. Afternoon brought with it an even greater test. One of the major vendors called with a sudden cancellation threat. My son's first instinct was panic, a flash of the old arrogance flaring before he caught himself. I let him grapple with it, guiding only when necessary with subtle prompts and questions designed to encourage reflection rather than obedience. Slowly, deliberately, he navigated the crisis, negotiating terms, restoring confidence, and taking ownership of the problem. For the first time, I saw the full measure of the lessons I had tried to impart silently over the years. That responsibility, humility, and patience are far more powerful than anger, entitlement, or fear. Evening approached, and the atmosphere in the house shifted from tense and anxious to quietly purposeful. My son and his wife worked in tandem, communicating respectfully, making decisions after careful consideration, and acknowledging the consequences of prior misjudgments. Small gestures, checking before acting, asking questions, pausing to listen, revealed a subtle transformation in their dynamic. What had begun as chaos born of arrogance and impatience was now evolving into collaboration and understanding. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily, the once oppressive air now charged with reflection and careful attention. Night fell, and I watched as the final preparations for the wedding arrangements concluded. My son approached me, hesitating, then spoke with a tone I had not heard in years, a mixture of humility, gratitude, and recognition. He acknowledged his mistakes, expressed understanding of the consequences, and for the first time, truly looked at me as both father and guide. His wife, too, seemed subdued, her previous superiority replaced with a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons she had observed. In that moment, I understood that the storm of conflict, chaos, and tension had accomplished what words never could. It had forced growth, reflection, and respect. Later that night, I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, reflecting on the past days. What had seemed like a confrontation over a single dinner had blossomed into a life lesson, a transformation not just in schedules and arrangements, but in character and understanding. The power of patience, foresight, and quiet authority had revealed itself fully. My son had learned that entitlement carries a cost, that respect must be earned, and that actions, no matter how seemingly trivial, have consequences that ripple far beyond immediate perception. As I closed the window and returned to my chair, I felt a deep sense of calm and satisfaction. The household had shifted. Arrogance had yielded to accountability, impatience to deliberation, and chaos to thoughtful order. I understood fully that true authority lies not in control or fear, but in wisdom, patience, and the ability to let consequences teach the lessons that words cannot. The storm had passed, and in its wake, growth, respect, and understanding had taken root. I leaned back, allowing a quiet smile to form, knowing that the lesson was finally understood, and that the foundation of family respect had been restored not through confrontation, but through foresight, patience, and unwavering calm.